A duke may ignore 10 noble brides, but he cannot ignore the one woman everyone else has already condemned. By the time the last carriage rolled through the iron gates of Whitmore Hall, snow had begun to fall over the Virginia countryside in slow, silent sheets, softening the black branches of the oaks and turning the long gravel drive into a pale ribbon beneath the moon. Inside the great house, every chandelier had been lit, every silver candlestick polished, every velvet curtain drawn against the cold, as though warmth and wealth could keep loneliness from entering. 10 young women stood beneath the painted ceiling of the ballroom, each dressed in silk, satin, or lace, each carrying the careful smile of someone raised to believe that beauty, breeding, and money were enough to secure a title. Their mothers whispered behind jeweled fans. Their fathers measured the room as if they were already dividing the estate in their minds. Tonight, Duke Adrian Whitmore was expected to choose a bride, and no family in the county had sent a daughter without hope. He was 36, widowed by rumor though never by law, feared for his silence, admired for his fortune, and spoken of in drawing rooms with the kind of caution reserved for storms that could ruin a harvest overnight. Some said his heart had frozen after a broken engagement years before. Some said Whitmore Hall itself had swallowed whatever tenderness he once possessed. Yet none of that kept the noble families away. A cold duke was still a duke. A wounded man was still a prize when his name could open every door in society. Near the far wall, where the candlelight thinned and the warmth of the fire did not quite reach, Clara Hayes stood with a silver tray of folded invitations in her gloved hands. She had not been invited as a bride. No one would have made that mistake. Her gown, though clean and carefully mended, was 3 seasons old, a washed gray blue that made her look almost like part of the winter pressing against the windows. She had come only because her aunt, Mrs. Lillian Crawford, required someone to carry messages, fetch shawls, and disappear when conversation turned important. Clara was very good at disappearing. Society had trained her well. She knew where to stand, when to lower her eyes, and how to breathe quietly while people discussed her as though she were an unfortunate piece of furniture left in the wrong room. Across the ballroom, Lady Evelyn Monroe laughed softly, the sound bright enough to turn heads and sharp enough to cut. She was the favorite, everyone knew it. Golden-haired, porcelain-skinned, and wrapped in ivory satin, she looked like the answer to every ambitious mother's prayer. When her gaze found Clara, amusement touched her mouth. Not surprise, not pity, recognition. The kind that said a woman like Clara could never be competition because she did not even belong on the same floor. Clara tightened her fingers around the tray until the silver chilled through her gloves. She did not move. She had learned long ago that dignity was sometimes nothing more than standing still while others waited for you to break. Then the ballroom doors opened. Conversation fell apart one whisper at a time. Duke Adrian Whitmore entered without announcement, dressed in black evening clothes that made the candlelight seem warmer by contrast. He was taller than most men in the room, with dark hair brushed back from a severe brow and eyes so gray they looked almost colorless beneath the chandeliers. He paused at the top of the marble steps and looked down at the 10 noble brides waiting for him. One by one, they straightened. Smiles bloomed. Fans lowered. Mothers held their breath. Adrian descended slowly, not with arrogance, but with the terrible calm of a man who had already made peace with disappointing everyone. He passed the first young lady with a courteous nod, the second with barely a glance. The third, fourth, and fifth received no more than the same unreadable attention one might give portraits in a hallway. By the 7th, the room had begun to shift uneasily. By the 9th, even Lady Evelyn's smile had tightened. By the 10th, silence had gathered so thickly that Clara could hear the faint crackle of wax dripping from a nearby candle. The Duke stopped in the center of the ballroom. For one suspended heartbeat, no one breathed. Then his eyes moved past the women presented to him, past the jewels, the silk, the careful bloodlines, and came to rest in the shadowed corner where Clara stood with the tray. She felt the look before she understood it. It crossed the room like a hand laid gently against a locked door. Her pulse struck once, hard. Aunt Lillian turned, saw where the Duke was looking, and went pale with irritation. Lady Evelyn's lips parted in disbelief. Clara lowered her gaze at once, certain she had made some mistake, certain the tray was crooked, her posture wrong, her presence offensive in some way she had failed to notice. But the room did not correct itself. The Duke did not look away. Instead, he took one step toward her, then another. The crowd opened before him, not out of welcome, but confusion. Clara's breath caught as the distance between them narrowed to 5 feet, then 4, then 3. Up close, Adrian Whitmore did not look cruel. He looked tired in a way no sleep could mend. His face carried the stillness of a house where every room had been closed for too long. He glanced at the tray in her hands, then at her mended gloves, then finally into her eyes. "Your name," he said, his voice low enough that it should not have carried, yet somehow the whole ballroom heard it. Clara swallowed. "Clara Hayes, Your Grace." A murmur moved through the guests, quick and poisonous. The girl no one wanted. The one without a dowry. The one Lord Ashford had cast aside. The one brought to fill space, not claim it. Adrian heard them. Clara knew he did, because something in his expression hardened, not loudly, not dramatically, but like ice forming over deep water. He turned his head slightly toward the 10 noble brides waiting beneath the chandeliers, then back to Clara. "Miss Hayes," he said, and the room seemed to lean toward him. "Why were you not presented among the others?" Clara could have lied. She could have smiled. She could have pretended not to understand. Instead, she looked at the polished floor between them and answered with the only thing she still owned. "The truth. Because no one expected me to be chosen." For the first time that evening, Duke Adrian Whitmore almost smiled. Not with pleasure, with recognition. Outside, snow struck the windows like soft white fingers begging to be let in. Inside, every noble family in the room waited for him to dismiss the girl and return to the women worthy of his name. But Adrian did not move away. He only extended his hand toward Clara, palm open, steady as a vow not yet spoken, and asked the question that turned 10 perfect brides into witnesses. "Then tell me, Miss Hayes," he said quietly, "who decided you were unwanted?" Clara had no answer, and the silence that followed her name felt larger than the ballroom itself. It spread from the marble steps to the velvet-draped windows, from the polished shoes of ambitious fathers to the trembling fans of their daughters, until even the musicians seemed afraid to breathe too loudly. Duke Adrian Whitmore's hand remained extended, patient and unshaken, while Clara stood before him with the silver tray held between them like the last fragile wall of her old life. She should have stepped back. She should have lowered her eyes and allowed someone more powerful to explain the joke, because surely that was what this must become. A misunderstanding. A cruel accident. A moment corrected by laughter. Lady Evelyn Monroe made certain it became exactly that. Her laugh rang out first, soft and bright, polished enough to seem harmless to anyone who did not hear the blade beneath it. "Your Grace," she said, gliding forward in ivory satin. "Miss Hayes is far too modest to answer such a question. I fear she is unaccustomed to being noticed." Several guests smiled. A few looked away, embarrassed not for Clara, but by the discomfort of seeing her brought into the center of a room where she had never belonged. Clara felt heat rise beneath her collar, though the ballroom remained cold. Adrian did not turn toward Lady Evelyn immediately. His eyes stayed on Clara, as if the laughter behind him mattered less than the way she had tightened her fingers around the tray. Only when Evelyn came close enough for her perfume to reach him did he shift his gaze. "And are you accustomed to deciding who deserves notice, Lady Evelyn?" he asked. The question was quiet. That made it worse. Evelyn's smile flickered, then returned with practiced grace. "Not at all, Your Grace. I only mean that Miss Hayes has suffered unfortunate circumstances. Society can be unkind to young women without protection." "Society is rarely unkind by accident," Adrian said. "It usually has help." The air changed. Clara saw it pass across the faces around them. That small tightening of mouths and shoulders when a man of rank refused to play by the expected rules. Aunt Lillian pushed forward, her cheeks flushed above her pearl necklace. "Your Grace, please forgive the confusion. Clara is my niece by obligation, not by introduction. She was never meant to be considered tonight." The words landed exactly as intended. Niece by obligation. Not family. Not equal. Not wanted. Clara kept her chin steady, but inside, something small folded in on itself. She had heard gentler insults. She had heard worse ones. Yet being reduced in front of the entire county by the woman who had raised her felt like standing beneath a chandelier, while each crystal quietly cut the light away. Then Lord Benjamin Ashford stepped from beside the fireplace, handsome in navy evening clothes, his expression arranged into sympathetic regret. He had the kind of face people trusted before learning the cost of trust. "Miss Hayes is a good young woman," he said, and Clara knew before the sentence ended that he meant to ruin her kindly. "But there are histories best left undisturbed. His Grace cannot be expected to know every local attachment, every broken understanding, every sad little promise that never became a wedding." A whisper ran through the guests. Clara's throat tightened. So this was how he would speak of it. Not that he had pursued her when her father's small estate still seemed useful. Not that he had disappeared when her inheritance proved tangled and nearly worthless. Not that his family had sent back her letters unopened. A sad little promise. That was all she had been allowed to keep. Lady Evelyn lowered her fan just enough to speak, her voice sweet as sugared ice. "One must admit, Lord Ashford behaved with remarkable restraint. Many men would not have been so careful with a girl in Miss Hayes's position." Clara looked at her then. Only once. Not in anger. Not in pleading. Merely looking. It was a strange thing, how cruel people disliked being seen clearly. Evelyn's smile thinned. "After all," she continued, turning slightly so the nearest guests could hear, "a woman without a proper dowry, without a secure name, and without a single proposal worth remembering cannot expect to be received as a duchess. Even kindness has limits." The room waited for Clara to break. She felt it. The hunger beneath the manners. The desire to watch a quiet woman finally prove every whisper true by trembling, crying, or running from the room. But Clara did none of those things. She set the silver tray on a nearby table with care, aligning its edge with the carved wood as if the smallest orders still mattered. Then she folded her hands before her and lifted her head. Her voice, when it came, was not loud. It did not need to be. "Lady Evelyn is correct about one matter. I have no proper dowry. I have no mother to arrange my introductions, no father living to defend my name, and no gentleman in this room who has ever found it profitable to remember me kindly." A hush followed. Benjamin's smile stiffened. Aunt Lillian whispered, "Clara, stop." But Clara had already spent too many years stopping. "But I have never sold affection for advantage," she said. "I have never dressed cruelty as concern. And I have never called another woman unwanted simply because I feared being overlooked beside her." For one heartbeat, the ballroom forgot how to pretend. Lady Evelyn's face paled, then flushed. Benjamin looked toward Adrian, expecting outrage, amusement, dismissal, anything that would place Clara back where society preferred her. Instead, the Duke watched Clara as though the crowded room had fallen away and left only the truth standing between them. The fire snapped softly in the hearth. Snow pressed against the tall windows. Adrian lowered his extended hand, not in withdrawal, but in decision. "Miss Hayes," he said, his voice carrying now to every corner of the ballroom, "you have been poorly judged by people who mistook price for worth." Clara's breath caught. Evelyn stepped forward. "Your Grace, surely you do not mean to elevate a scene into a scandal." Adrian turned to her at last, and the full chill of his attention settled over the ivory satin and the perfect smile. "No, Lady Evelyn. I mean to end one." Then he looked back at Clara, and something in his severe expression softened, so briefly that only she could have noticed. "You asked for no rescue," he said. "That is why I believe you deserve one." The sentence did not sound like mercy. It sounded like a verdict, and because Duke Adrian Whitmore spoke it without raising his voice, the whole ballroom seemed to grow colder around him. Clara stood so still that she could feel the weight of every gaze settle against her skin, not his hands, but his judgments, old and practiced and hungry to remain true. She had spent years surviving rooms like this by making herself small. She had learned the geography of shame. The corners where unmarried women were placed, the hallways where servants pretended not to hear, the breakfast tables where family could wound with a folded newspaper and a sigh. Yet now Adrian had drawn her into the center of the largest room in Whitmore Hall, and there was nowhere left to vanish. "Your Grace," Aunt Lillian said, her voice trembling between anger and alarm, "you are a gentleman of excellent judgment. Surely you will not permit one unfortunate exchange to determine the future of your house." Adrian's eyes did not leave Clara. "My house has endured worse than honesty." Lady Evelyn gave a delicate laugh, though the sound had lost its music. Honesty is admirable in its place, of course. But marriage is not a charity table. A duchess must bring more than wounded pride and a brave little speech. Clara lowered her eyes again, not because Evelyn had conquered her, but because some truths were too exhausting to watch. She had nothing to offer that could be measured in acres, bonds, or jewels. Her father had left behind a few books, a tarnished watch, and the kind of name that respectable people mentioned only after lowering their voices. Her mother had left even less, though Clara still carried her memory in a white handkerchief embroidered with a single blue flower, folded carefully inside her sleeve. It was the only thing she owned that no one had managed to take from her. Lord Benjamin Ashford stepped closer, his polished concern returning like a mask placed over a crack. "Miss Hayes deserves protection from embarrassment," he said. "This spectacle will follow her. A duke's impulsive kindness may feel noble tonight, but tomorrow's society will be less forgiving." Adrian turned then. Slowly. The movement was small, but it silenced 3 nearby whispers at once. "You speak often of Miss Hayes's protection, Lord Ashford, for a man who abandoned it when it cost him nothing to keep." Benjamin's face tightened. "I acted according to circumstance." "No," Adrian said. "You acted according to advantage." A breath passed through the room. Clara looked up despite herself. Benjamin's eyes flashed, then cooled as he remembered where he stood and who had just addressed him. "I will not quarrel in your home, your grace." "That is wise." The words fell gently. They landed hard. Then Adrian faced Clara fully and extended his hand again. This time there was no question hidden in the gesture. It was not theatrical. It was not warm. It was something far more dangerous in a room built on performance. It was sincere. "Miss Hayes," he said, "I asked who decided you were unwanted. I now have my answer." Clara's pulse trembled in her throat. "And what answer is that, your grace?" "Everyone who found your dignity inconvenient." She looked at his hand. The glove was black, finely stitched, held steady in the candlelight. If she took it, she would not merely cross a ballroom. She would cross out of the life to which others had assigned her, and into a future she did not understand. If she refused, she might keep what little safety remained in being overlooked. Safety. The word almost made her laugh. There had been no safety in Aunt Lillian's house, only shelter with a debt attached. There had been no safety in Benjamin's promises, only manners that expired when profit did. There had been no safety in silence, only the slow discipline of swallowing pain until it resembled grace. Still, Clara did not move. "You do not know me," she said. "No," Adrian's answer came at once. "But I know this room. I know what it rewards. I know what it destroys. And I know you stood in the middle of its cruelty without becoming cruel yourself." Lady Evelyn's fan snapped shut. "This is absurd." Adrian did not look at her. "It is uncommon. That is why it offends you." A few of the older women gasped. Somewhere near the musicians, a violin string gave a faint, strained sound, as if the instrument itself had grown nervous. Clara felt the world narrowing to the space between her hand and his. She thought of the 10 noble brides waiting beneath the chandeliers, each one trained from childhood for a moment like this. She thought of her mother's embroidered handkerchief hidden against her wrist. She thought of every door that had closed softly in her face because no one wished to be rude enough to slam it. Then Clara placed her gloved hand in the Duke's. The contact was brief, proper, and devastating. Adrian's fingers closed around hers with restrained care, as though he understood that a woman could be both brave and breakable in the same breath. He turned with her beside him, and the ballroom shifted back as if the pair of them carried a storm no one dared touch. "Ladies and gentlemen," Adrian said, his voice carrying beneath the chandeliers, "you came tonight expecting me to choose a bride from among those presented to me. I have done so." Clara heard Aunt Lillian inhale sharply. Evelyn went white with disbelief. Benjamin stared as if the floor had moved beneath him. Adrian continued, calm as winter. "Miss Clara Hayes will remain at Whitmore Hall this evening as my honored guest. Tomorrow, with her consent, I will call upon her guardian to discuss an engagement." Clara's heart struck so hard she feared he would feel it through her hand. "With my consent?" she whispered. Adrian looked down at her then, and for the first time, the severity in his face softened into something almost human. Always. That single word did what no compliment could have done. It steadied her, not because it promised happiness. It promised choice. And choice, to Clara Hayes, felt more impossible than love. Outside, snow continued to fall over the long driveway, covering every track that had led the guests to Whitmore Hall. Inside, beneath 100 candles and the stunned silence of 10 noble families, Clara stood beside the Duke, who had just unsettled an entire county by offering her not pity, not rescue, but the one thing no one else had ever trusted her to hold: her own future. The announcement did not end the evening. It fractured it. The ballroom remained bright. The fires continued to burn. The musicians still held their instruments. Yet every person inside Whitmore Hall seemed to understand that something irreversible had taken place beneath the chandeliers. Clara felt Adrian's hand release hers with the same restraint with which he had taken it, and the absence of his touch left her strangely aware of the cold air around her fingers. For a moment no one moved. Then the whispers began again, softer now, sharper because they had to hide behind courtesy. Aunt Lillian reached Clara first, her smile trembling at the edges like thin glass under pressure. "My dear child," she said, though she had not called Clara dear in many years, "you must be overwhelmed. His Grace has been generous, but perhaps we should speak privately before excitement carries anyone too far." Clara knew that tone. It was the tone Aunt Lillian used when guests were present and obedience was expected to dress itself as gratitude. Before Clara could answer, Adrian spoke from beside her. "Mrs. Crawford, Miss Hayes will have whatever privacy she requests. She will not be instructed into silence." Lillian's cheeks colored. "I would never presume to silence her." "You already have," Adrian said. No one nearby pretended not to hear. Clara lowered her gaze, not from shame this time, but to steady the sudden, painful warmth rising behind her eyes. She would not cry in front of them, not after surviving their laughter. Not now. Adrian seemed to sense it, for he offered his arm with formal distance. "Miss Hayes, the library is quieter. You may refuse my company there as easily as you may accept it." The choice was placed before her again, careful and deliberate. Clara looked once toward the ballroom. Lady Evelyn stood among the rejected brides, her ivory satin glowing like frost beneath candlelight, her expression too composed to be called anger and too pale to be called calm. Lord Benjamin watched Clara with an unreadable face, but his hand had tightened around the stem of his glass. Aunt Lillian waited with a warning in her eyes. Clara turned back to Adrian. "The library, Your Grace." They walked through the opening crowd without haste. No one stopped them. No one dared. Beyond the ballroom doors, the noise dulled at once, replaced by the hush of long corridors, the faint tick of a grandfather clock, and the soft hiss of snow striking the tall windows. Whitmore Hall seemed different outside the glare of society, less like a stage and more like a tomb that had been taught to host guests. Portraits lined the walls, their painted eyes following Clara as she passed. Some faces looked proud. Some looked lonely. One, half hidden by shadow near the turn of the corridor, had been draped in black cloth. Clara noticed Adrian's jaw tighten as they passed it. He did not explain. The library stood at the end of a narrow hall, warmed by a low fire and filled with shelves that rose nearly 20 feet toward a ceiling crossed by dark wooden beams. Adrian closed the door, but not fully. The gesture was proper, intentional, and Clara understood it as a kind of respect. He crossed to the hearth, then stopped as if unsure whether standing near the flames would make him seem too imposing. "You asked why," he said. Clara held her gloves in both hands. "I asked because no sensible man would do what you did tonight without a reason. I have several." "Then begin with the one least likely to flatter me." At that, something almost like amusement touched his eyes and vanished. "Very well. I need a duchess whom the old families cannot control." Clara absorbed the words slowly. There it was. Not romance. Not rescue. A bargain wearing evening clothes. She should have felt disappointed, but disappointment required expectation, and she had learned to ration that long ago. "And you believe they cannot control me because they do not value me. Because they underestimated you," Adrian corrected. "There is a difference." Clara moved toward the fire, letting its warmth reach her hands. "You do not know whether I am fit to be a duchess." "No," he said. "I know you are fit to remain yourself under pressure. That is rarer." She looked at him then, truly looked. The severe line of his mouth, the guarded eyes, the stillness that did not feel empty but locked. This was not a man acting on impulse alone. This was a man setting a match to a structure he despised, even though he lived inside it. You wish to punish them, Clara said. Adrian did not deny it. Partly. The honesty startled her more than a denial would have. Then I cannot accept. His expression changed, not dramatically, but enough for the firelight to catch the shadow of surprise. Clara drew herself straighter. I have been used as a burden, a lesson, a warning, and a convenience. I will not become a weapon simply because your enemies are more polished than mine. The silence that followed was deep and strangely gentle. Outside the library, distant voices rose and fell, but inside, the room seemed to hold its breath around them. Adrian looked down at his hands, then back to her. You are right. Clara had prepared herself for persuasion. She had not prepared herself for agreement. If there is to be any arrangement, he conned. By midnight, Whitmore Hall had emptied of music, but not of consequence. The last carriage disappeared down the snow-covered drive with its lanterns trembling like angry stars, carrying away 10 disappointed brides, 10 injured families, and enough whispered outrage to warm every parlor in Virginia by morning. Clara watched from the library window as the final set of wheels cut dark tracks through the white ground. She had expected relief when the guests were gone. Instead, the silence that settled over the house felt heavier than the noise. Behind her, Duke Adrian Whitmore stood beside the desk where the unfinished terms of their arrangement lay folded beneath a brass paperweight. Neither of them had signed anything. Yet both understood that the knight had already signed them in the minds of everyone who had witnessed it. My carriage will take you back to your aunt's house, Adrian said. Mrs. Crawford has requested it. Clara did not turn from the window. Requested? Demanded, with excellent posture. Despite herself, Clara almost smiled. It came and vanished quickly, a small, unfamiliar thing. And what did you answer? That you would decide. There it was again. Choice. He offered it so plainly that she found herself suspicious of it, as though freedom spoken in a man's voice might still conceal a lock. Beyond the glass, snow continued to fall in soft sheets, covering the tracks as soon as they were made. If I return tonight, Clara said, my aunt will call the matter confusion. By breakfast, she will have decided I misunderstood you. By noon, she will have convinced 3 neighbors that I forced your attention upon myself. Adrian's reflection appeared beside hers in the window, dark and still. And if you remain, then they will say worse. Yes. His honesty was almost cruel, but it steadied her. They will say you are ambitious, improper, ungrateful. They will say I was deceived, and when that becomes inconvenient, they will say I was bewitched. Society prefers a foolish man to a worthy woman it failed to recognize. Clara looked down at her hands. The faint mark on her wrist had faded, but she still felt the memory of fingers closing around her arm, the familiar pressure of being guided, corrected, contained. I have one trunk at my aunt's house, she said quietly. Most of what is inside is not worth sending for. Adrian did not answer at once. When he did, his voice had lowered. Things need not be valuable to be yours. The sentence moved through Clara with unexpected force. For years, ownership had been conditional. Her room belonged to Aunt Lillian. Her dresses belonged to necessity. Her time belonged to whoever needed an errand. Even her reputation seemed to belong to people who enjoyed lowering it. But the little trunk, with its cracked leather handle and lavender sachet hidden beneath old letters, was hers. I would like it sent here, she said. Only if I may write the instructions myself. Adrian gave a single nod. Mrs. Bell will arrange a messenger at first light. At the mention of the housekeeper, the library door opened as if summoned by the name. Mrs. Margaret Bell entered carrying a lamp, her gray hair pinned neatly beneath a lace cap, her expression composed but not unkind. She was a small woman, yet she seemed to carry the authority of someone who had outlived every storm the house could produce. The East guest suite has been prepared, Your Grace, she said. Fresh linens, fire laid, and hot tea waiting. Clara turned. That is far too much trouble. Mrs. Bell looked at her with a softness so sudden that Clara felt almost unsteady beneath it. A cold night is trouble, Miss Hayes. A room made ready is simply a duty done properly. Adrian moved toward the door, then paused. Mrs. Bell, Miss Hayes is to be treated as an honored guest of this house. The housekeeper's eyes did not leave Clara. I understood that before you said it, Your Grace. Something passed between the older woman and the Duke, brief and weighted, as though Whitmore Hall had its own language of silences. Clara followed Mrs. Bell through the corridor while Adrian remained behind in the library, his figure framed by firelight and the shadow of shelves. The hall beyond seemed longer now that the guests had gone. Without laughter and conversation, the mansion revealed itself as a place of sealed doors, covered portraits, and carpets too thick to make footsteps sound alive. Halfway up the grand staircase, Clara noticed the black-draped portrait again. In the dim glow of Mrs. Bell's lamp, the cloth shifted slightly in a draft, revealing the edge of a painted hand and the suggestion of a pale blue ribbon. Clara slowed. Who was that? Mrs. Bell's fingers tightened around the lamp handle. A member of the family. The Duke looked pained when we passed it earlier. Most people in this house are careful not to notice what pains him. Clara considered that. Careful or afraid? Mrs. Bell glanced at her then, and for the first time, her face carried something like approval. Both Miss Hayes. They reached the East guest suite at the end of a quiet passage. The room was larger than Clara's entire quarters at Aunt Lillian's house, with a carved bed, a writing desk, faded blue curtains, and a fire burning low in a white marble hearth. A porcelain basin steamed gently on a washstand. Tea waited beside a plate of buttered toast, as if someone had remembered that dignity did not keep a person from hunger. Clara stood just inside the door, overwhelmed by the simple fact that nothing in the room demanded service from her. Mrs. Bell set the lamp down. There is a bell pull by the bed. Use it for anything you need. Clara almost said she would need nothing. The old habit rose quickly, obedient as a trained dog. But Adrian's words returned. Things need not be valuable to be yours. She looked at the housekeeper. Thank you, Mrs. Bell. I may need paper before morning. Mrs. Bell's gaze flickered to Clara's sleeve, where the edge of the embroidered handkerchief had slipped free. The older woman went very still. Where did you get that? Clara touched it instinctively. It was my mother's. The room seemed to lose a little warmth. Mrs. Bell stepped closer, not rudely, but with the careful disbelief of someone seeing a ghost choose flesh. May I? Clara hesitated, then unfolded the handkerchief. A single blue flower rested in one corner, stitched with delicate thread, faded but unmistakable. Mrs. Bell drew in a breath. I have seen this pattern before. Clara's heart began to beat harder. Where? The housekeeper looked toward the dark hallway, then back at Clara, and whatever answer she carried seemed too heavy for the quiet room. At last she folded her hands and said softly, In this house, Miss Hayes. Long before tonight. Clara did not sleep. Long after Mrs. Bell had left the room with the unfinished answer folded behind her careful eyes, Clara sat beside the low fire with her mother's handkerchief spread across her knees and watched the blue flower tremble whenever the flames shifted. The East guest suite was warm, quiet, and finer than any room she had ever been permitted to call her own, yet the comfort unsettled her more than hardship ever had. Hardship asked only endurance. Kindness asked trust, and Clara had never been given enough of it to learn its shape. Beyond the windows, Whitmore Hall slept beneath nearly 4 inches of snow, the lawns softened to silver, the trees bent under white silence, the long driveway erased as though the world had closed behind her. Sometime before dawn, unable to bear the questions gathering in the room, Clara wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and stepped into the corridor. The house at night seemed less like a mansion than a memory holding its breath. Lamps burned low along the walls. Portraits watched from their gilded frames. The floor beneath her slippers gave no sound. She did not intend to wander far, but the black-draped portrait on the landing drew her as surely as a whispered name. The cloth stirred in the faint draft from the stairwell, revealing again that painted hand and the pale blue ribbon around the wrist. Clara stood before it, her own hand closing around the handkerchief hidden in her sleeve. A strange recognition moved through her, not of a face, for the face remained covered, but of grief carefully arranged so visitors would not have to see it. You should not be here. Adrian's voice came from the foot of the stairs, low and roughened by sleeplessness. Clara turned at once. He stood in a dark coat over an open shirt collar, a lamp in one hand, his hair less severe than it had been in the ballroom. Without the armor of formal clothes and public silence, he looked younger in one way and older in another, as though the night had removed a mask but not the sorrow beneath it. Forgive me, Clara said. I could not rest. His eyes moved to the portrait, and something closed in his face. Most guests choose tea for that. I have never been practiced at being a guest." The words softened the air between them, but only for a moment. Adrian ascended the stairs slowly, stopping several feet away, careful not to crowd her. "This wing is private." Clara glanced at the covered canvas. "Because of her?" His jaw tightened. "Because of what happened to her." The answer carried a warning, but not a threat. Clara should have let it rest. She knew the rules of wounded houses. Do not touch the locked doors. Do not ask why the servants lower their voices. Do not name the dead unless the living do so first. Yet Mrs. Bell's expression returned to her, pale and startled over the embroidered blue flower. "Mrs. Bell recognized something of my mother's tonight," Clara said quietly. "She said she had seen it in this house." Adrian's gaze sharpened. "What thing?" Clara drew the handkerchief from her sleeve and unfolded it beneath the dim lamp. The blue flower appeared small against the white linen, fragile and faded, yet the moment Adrian saw it, the color left his face. He reached toward it, then stopped himself before his fingers could touch. "Where did you get that?" "It belonged to my mother. Her name was Eliza Hayes." For several seconds, Adrian said nothing. Downstairs, the old clock began to mark the hour, each strike moving through the hall like a footstep from the past. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed. "Eliza did not use the name Hayes when she was here." Clara's breath caught. "You knew her?" "I was 17. She was a companion to my sister, not a servant, no matter what certain relatives preferred to call her. She had very little money, but she carried herself as though poverty were an inconvenience other people insisted on mentioning." Clara held the handkerchief tighter. The description struck too close, not because it was cruel, but because it sounded like a life reaching for her through the dark. "What happened?" Adrian looked at the covered portrait. "My sister, Margaret, was promised to a man chosen for his family's influence. She did not want him. Eliza was the only person in this house brave enough to say that duty without mercy becomes a cage." Clara remembered her own words in the library and felt a chill that did not come from the corridor. "And the portrait?" "My sister left Whitmore Hall before the wedding could be completed. Society called it disgrace. My family called it betrayal. Eliza helped her go." He paused, and the lamp flame flickered across the hard line of his mouth. "For that, Eliza was dismissed and spoken of poorly by people who feared the truth she carried." Clara felt the hallway tilt beneath her. All her life, her mother had been described in softened fragments: imprudent, unsuitable, unfortunate, a woman who had made her own difficulties. But here, in this frozen house, another version lived. Brave, loyal, unbought. "Did she know?" Clara asked. "Know what?" "That she would lose everything for helping your sister." Adrian looked at her then, and the guarded sorrow in his eyes became almost unbearable. "Yes." The answer settled between them, quiet and immense. Clara turned back to the draped portrait, seeing no face, yet suddenly understanding why grief had been covered rather than buried. "Then this house did not only mourn your sister," she said. "It punished the woman who tried to save her." Adrian flinched, not visibly enough for most people to notice, but Clara noticed. She was beginning to understand that he did not shout when wounded. He became still. "You speak as though the house acted alone." "Did it?" For a moment, he said nothing. Then he reached up and took the edge of the black cloth in his hand. The movement was slow, almost reverent. "No," he pulled the drape aside. A young woman's painted face emerged from shadow, pale and solemn, with a blue ribbon at her wrist and eyes that looked past the artist toward a door no one else could see. Clara stared, not because the woman resembled her, for she did not, but because the embroidered blue flower on the handkerchief matched the ribbon in the portrait exactly. Adrian's voice dropped to a whisper. "My sister loved Eliza as the only true friend she had, and I let my family erase them both from every respectable conversation." Clara looked at him through the dim gold of the lamp. "Why show me now?" His hand fell from the cloth. "Because you were right in the library. A locked room does not keep grief inside. It keeps everyone else outside." In the silence that followed, Clara understood that Whitmore Hall had not chosen her by accident. Her mother's courage had once passed through these halls and been buried beneath shame. Now the daughter had returned, carrying a faded blue flower, and the man who had offered her a future was staring at the past as though it had finally come to demand an answer. By morning, the story had already outrun the snow. It traveled first with the drivers who had waited beneath the carriage house roof. then with the footmen who carried cloaks, then with the ladies who pretended they would never gossip while repeating every detail before breakfast. By noon, every respectable parlor within 20 miles had heard that Duke Adrian Whitmore had dismissed 10 noble brides and kept Clara Hayes beneath his roof. By 4 o'clock, the tale had improved itself into scandal. Clara learned this not from Adrian, who had spent the day in his study with legal papers and old family ledgers, but from the way the servants moved too quietly around her, as though rumor itself had entered Whitmore Hall and taken a chair at the table. Mrs. Bell brought tea to the East guest suite with a folded newspaper tucked beneath the tray. "You should read it before someone reads it at you," the housekeeper said. Clara unfolded the paper beside the window, where pale winter light fell across the printed words. There was no mention of her name, of course. Society rarely did a woman the kindness of accusing her directly when implication could bruise more politely. The notice described a certain young lady of uncertain family, a northern house too long secluded, and an evening in which generosity may have been mistaken for judgment. Clara read it once. Then again. Her face remained still, but her fingers pressed into the paper until it creased. "Lady Evelyn," she said. Mrs. Bell poured tea without looking surprised, likely with Lord Ashford holding the inkwell. Clara looked out at the white lawn, where 2 gardeners were clearing a path toward the chapel ruins beyond the west garden. "I thought humiliation would feel different once I had somewhere safe to stand." Mrs. Bell set the cup down gently. "Safety does not stop cruelty from knocking, Miss Hayes. It only gives you a door to close." The words had hardly settled when a knock sounded in the corridor. Adrian entered only after Clara gave permission, dressed in dark gray, his expression controlled, but his eyes already on the newspaper in her hand. "I had hoped to reach you first." "So did the gossip," Clara said. He accepted that with the faintest bow of his head. "There is to be a gathering tomorrow evening at Monroe House." Clara folded the paper carefully. "Lady Evelyn's home." "Yes. An engagement supper, though no engagement has been announced. She has invited half the county and implied that I will attend to correct last night's confusion." "Will you?" "Not unless you wish to go." Clara almost laughed at the impossibility of it. "Why would I wish to walk into a room prepared for my disgrace?" Adrian's answer came quietly. "Because if you do not, they will write the ending without you." The truth of it made her turn away. The fire in the hearth breathed low and red, reflected faintly in the window glass. Behind her, Adrian did not move closer. He had learned already that rescue, if given too quickly, could resemble control. "You need not prove yourself to them," he said, "but you may choose to deny them the pleasure of your absence." Clara looked down at her mother's handkerchief, folded beside the newspaper. The blue flower seemed smaller in daylight, yet no less stubborn. Eliza had lost her place in this house because she helped another woman choose freedom. Years later, her daughter was being asked to choose visibility over concealment. It felt almost cruel, the way courage could echo through generations and still arrive trembling. "If I go," Clara said, "I go as myself. Not as your charity, not as your revenge." "Then I will stand beside you as myself," Adrian replied. "Not as your owner, not as your savior." Mrs. Bell turned away toward the tea tray, but not before Clara saw the older woman's mouth soften. That evening, Clara's trunk arrived from Aunt Lillian's house, packed hastily and with little care. A few dresses had been folded inside out. Her books were bent at the corners. Her letters had been tied too tightly with twine. Yet at the bottom, beneath a worn shawl, Clara found a small wooden box she had not seen since childhood. Inside lay 3 more pieces of her mother's embroidery, each marked with the same blue flower, and a folded note in a hand she did not recognize. Mrs. Bell was called at once. She read the note near the fire, and the color drained slowly from her cheeks. "This was written by Lady Margaret Whitmore," she whispered. Adrian, summoned from the study, took the page with unsteady care. Clara watched his eyes move across the lines. For the first time since she had met him, his composure did not merely crack. It failed him. "What does it say?" Clara asked. Adrian looked at her, and the past stood between them like an open door. "It says your mother did not leave Whitmore Hall in disgrace. She left carrying proof that my sister had been forced into an arrangement for money." Clara felt the room narrow. Proof against whom? Adrian's expression hardened with a sorrow that had finally found a target. Against the Monroe family. The name struck the silence like a bell. Lady Evelyn's family. The same family now preparing a room full of witnesses to destroy Clara before she could be believed. Mrs. Bell crossed herself softly, then lowered her hand as if remembering where she stood. Clara reached for the note, and Adrian gave it to her without hesitation. The paper was old, the ink faded, but the words remained clear enough to wound. Eliza knows the truth. If I am silenced by marriage, she must carry it where I cannot. Clara read the line twice, feeling not fear now, but something colder and cleaner. Understanding. Lady Evelyn does not only want to shame me, she said. She wants whatever my mother carried to remain buried. Adrian's eyes met hers. Then tomorrow night is no longer a trap. Clara folded the note along its old creases and placed it beside the blue-flowered handkerchief. Outside, snow began again, quiet and relentless against the dark windows. No, she said, her voice steady in a way that surprised even herself. Tomorrow night is a reckoning. Monroe House glittered as if it had never known shame. Every window blazing against the winter dark, every pillar wrapped in evergreen, every polished step swept clean of snow before the first carriage arrived. Clara saw the mansion from Adrian's carriage and understood at once why Lady Evelyn had chosen it for the evening. Whitmore Hall carried grief in its stones, but Monroe House carried pride. It stood wide and bright upon a hill, less like a home than a declaration that old families could survive any truth by entertaining beautifully around it. Adrian sat across from Clara, dressed in black, his gloves resting across one knee, his face unreadable beneath the shifting glow of the carriage lamps. Between them, in a small leather case, lay Lady Margaret's note, 3 blue-flowered embroideries, and the folded newspaper that had tried to turn Clara into a whisper before she could become a witness. "You may still change your mind," Adrian said as the carriage slowed. Clara looked at the front doors, where footmen in green livery waited beneath lanterns. "I changed my mind years ago, Your Grace." His eyes lifted to hers. "About what?" "About surviving quietly enough for cruel people to call it peace." The carriage stopped. For a moment, neither moved. Then Adrian opened the door himself before the footman could reach it and stepped down into the snow. He offered his hand, not possessively, not publicly enough to perform, but steadily enough that Clara knew the choice remained hers until the last inch. She took it. A dozen faces turned before she reached the top step. By the time the butler announced them, the hall beyond had already begun to murmur, "His Grace, Duke Adrian Whitmore, and Miss Clara Hayes." The words crossed the room like a lit match. Lady Evelyn stood near the hearth in silver silk, surrounded by women who looked at Clara as though she were an unexpected stain on a white tablecloth. Lord Benjamin Ashford stood beside her, handsome, calm, and foolish enough to believe calmness could still pass for innocence. Aunt Lillian was there too, pale with resentment, her pearls bright against a throat tightened by outrage. Clara entered without lowering her eyes. That was the first victory, not the grandest, not the loudest, but the first. Lady Evelyn waited until every conversation had bent toward them before she moved forward. "Miss Hayes," she said, her smile perfect enough to belong in a portrait no one loved. "How brave of you to come. Many young women would have remained at home after such confusion." Clara removed her gloves slowly. Confusion belongs to those who did not listen clearly. A few fans stopped moving. Evelyn's smile thinned. "Then perhaps we should offer clarity. This county has known your situation for years, and while compassion has its place, one cannot build a ducal household upon mystery." Adrian's voice cut in, quiet and cold. "Be careful, Lady Evelyn. Some mysteries were made by families who feared the records." Benjamin gave a polished laugh. "Surely we have not gathered to discuss dusty papers. The question before society is simple. What claim has Miss Hayes to stand where 10 proper ladies were refused?" Clara felt the old room watching, waiting for her to shrink. But she thought of her mother's handkerchief, of Lady Margaret's covered portrait, of Mrs. Bell's trembling voice in the firelight. She stepped forward. "None, if worth is counted only in dowries." Evelyn's eyes brightened, sensing weakness. "At least we agree on that. But if worth is counted in truth," Clara continued, "then I may have brought more to this room than anyone expected." Adrian opened the leather case. The gesture was small, but every eye followed it. He placed Lady Margaret's note upon a table beside the hearth, then the embroidered blue flowers, then an old ledger page bearing the Monroe seal. Evelyn did not move, but the color beneath her powder changed. Benjamin looked first at the paper, then at her. Adrian spoke to the room, not loudly, because certainty did not require volume. 20 years ago, my sister Margaret Whitmore was pressured toward a marriage arranged to protect a financial agreement between my family and the Monroes. She refused. Clara Hayes's mother, Eliza, helped her refuse. For that act of courage, Eliza was dismissed, slandered, and erased from polite memory. The room had gone utterly still. Lady Evelyn's father, a heavy-set man near the window, gripped the back of a chair. Evelyn lifted her chin. Old grief makes poor evidence. Clara unfolded the note with hands that no longer shook. Then perhaps Lady Margaret's own words will do better. She read only the necessary lines, her voice clear enough to carry beneath the chandelier. Eliza knows the truth. If I am silenced by marriage, she must carry it where I cannot. A woman near the pianoforte gasped softly. Aunt Lillian stared at Clara as though seeing, with great inconvenience, a person where a burden had once stood. Benjamin's composure began to crack at the edges. This proves nothing about Miss Hayes herself, he said. On the contrary, Adrian replied. It proves she inherited the one quality this room has repeatedly failed to purchase. Honor. Evelyn's face hardened. You would raise her above us because of a dead woman's sentiment. Clara looked at her then, fully and without fear. No, Lady Evelyn. I am not above you because of my mother. I am standing here because she was pushed below people who were never worthy to judge her. The words landed without shouting. That made them impossible to dismiss. Adrian turned to the guests. Let the record be corrected tonight. Eliza Hayes was not disgraced. She was punished for telling the truth. And Clara Hayes is not an object of pity. She is the daughter of a woman this house should have honored long ago. Silence followed, deep and complete. Then Mrs. Bell, who had come quietly with the Whitmore servants and stood near the doorway, lowered her head in open respect. One by one, others followed, not all from kindness, some from fear, some from calculation, but all because the room had changed direction and no one wished to be left facing the wrong way. Evelyn remained upright, shining, and defeated by the very witnesses she had gathered. Clara felt no triumph. Only breath. Only space. Only the strange, aching freedom of no longer carrying a shame that had never belonged to her. Adrian stepped beside her, close enough to be present, far enough to let the moment remain hers. Miss Hayes, he said softly, for her alone, they see you now. Clara looked across the bright room, past the jewels, past the titles, past every face that had once made her feel invisible. No, she said, her voice calm as falling snow. They are only just learning how blind they have been. The respect that moved through Monroe House did not sound like applause. It sounded like silence learning humility. Clara stood beneath the chandelier with the old note folded in her hands, feeling every eye upon her. Yet for the first time in her life, their attention did not seem to reduce her. It could not make her smaller than the truth now lying open on Lady Evelyn's polished table. Lady Evelyn said nothing. Her silver gown still shone. Her posture remained perfect, but the pride in her face had become a locked door with no room left behind it. Lord Benjamin Ashford looked away first. That was his confession. Aunt Lillian stared at Clara with an expression Clara had once prayed to see, not affection, not apology, but fear of having misjudged someone who could no longer be managed. Adrian offered his arm, and Clara took it only after a breath of her own choosing. Together they crossed the room, not hurriedly, not triumphantly, but with the calm of people who had survived the worst a room could do and found the door still open. No one stopped them. Outside, the night had deepened. Snow fell over the steps of Monroe House in clean white sheets, covering carriage tracks, footprints, and every sign that guests had arrived carrying judgment. Adrian helped Clara into the carriage, then sat across from her as he had before, though something between them had changed. The leather case rested beside her. The handkerchief lay folded over the note, its blue flower catching the faint gold of the lamp. For several minutes, only the wheels spoke, crunching softly through the snow as Monroe House disappeared behind the black trees. Clara looked out the window, watching the grand lights shrink into the distance. I thought I would feel victorious, she said at last. Adrian's gaze lifted. And do you? No, she touched the handkerchief. I feel tired. And free. The two are strangely alike tonight. Freedom often arrives after endurance has spent everything it had. His voice was quiet, almost too quiet for the carriage. Clara turned from the window. You spoke for my mother tonight. Too late. The answer came without defense. But you spoke. Because you gave me courage to look at what my family buried. Clara studied him in the dim light. The severe duke who had crossed a ballroom for her now looked less like a rescuer than a man standing before the ruins of his own silence. That made him more human, more difficult to hate, more dangerous to trust. What happens now? She asked. Adrian removed his gloves slowly, as though every word required care. Tomorrow, I will send letters correcting the public record. Mrs. Bell will help restore Lady Margaret's portrait to the main hall. Your mother's name will be entered into the Whitmore family archive as it should have been 20 years ago. And after that, if you wish to leave, my carriage will take you anywhere within 500 miles and farther if needed. Clara's breath caught, not because he offered the road, but because no chain was hidden inside the offer. And if I stay? Adrian looked at her then, and the grief in his face did not vanish, but it made room for hope. Then I will spend whatever time you allow proving that my first choice of you was not my last act of courage. The words settled between them, warmer than the carriage blanket around her knees. Clara looked down at her hands. All her life, men had made decisions around her and called them protection. Families had arranged rooms around her and called them kindness. Society had named her unwanted so often that the word had begun to sound less like an insult and more like weather. Yet tonight, the title had fallen away, not because a duke had chosen her, because she had chosen not to bow beneath it. When they reached Whitmore Hall, the house stood quiet beneath the snow, its windows glowing with low amber light. Mrs. Bell waited in the entrance hall, and behind her, servants had gathered without ceremony. No one cheered. They simply stood aside as Clara entered, and that simple gesture, the making of space without demand, nearly undid her. On the landing, the black cloth had been removed from Lady Margaret's portrait. The painted woman looked down at the hall with her pale blue ribbon at her wrist, no longer hidden, no longer ashamed. Clara stopped before it. Adrian stopped beside her. Mrs. Bell placed one hand over her heart. For a moment, the living and the remembered shared the same breath. Clara unfolded her mother's handkerchief and held it beneath the portrait. The blue flower and the blue ribbon answered each other across time. She was not erased, Clara whispered. No, Adrian said, only waiting for someone worthy to remember her. Clara turned to him then. The old fear was still inside her, but it no longer ruled the room. I will stay, she said. Adrian did not smile at once. He bowed his head, as though receiving not a reward, but a responsibility. Then Whitmore Hall is yours to change. Clara looked around the shadowed entrance hall, at the servants watching with damp eyes, at Mrs. Bell standing straighter than she had in years, at the portrait finally uncovered, at the Duke who had learned that love could not be commanded, only deserved. Not mine alone, she said. A house should not be healed by one woman, while everyone else admires her strength. For the first time, Adrian smiled fully, quietly, as if some locked room within him had opened to morning. Outside, snow continued to fall, but inside Whitmore Hall, fires were lit in rooms long closed. The next spring, society would speak of the engagement as though it had always been inevitable. They would pretend they had seen Clara's worth from the beginning. Clara would let them pretend. She had no need to correct every cowardly memory. She knew the truth. Adrian knew it. Mrs. Bell knew it. And somewhere in the restored hall, beneath the watchful eyes of a woman who had once fled duty to save her soul, Eliza Hayes's blue flower remained framed beside Lady Margaret's portrait. Some women are never unwanted. They are merely kept from the hands that would not know how to hold them.